Dawn did not break over Cinderglass Basin. It was torn apart. The eastern storm wall, a monolithic arc of engineered silicate, meant to withstand the hyper-hurricanes of Moon Nacre 9, detonated. It was not a conventional explosion. The Serekh Dominion utilized resonance artillery, weapons that did not rely on crude heat or kinetic impact, but rather sang a frequency that forced molecular bonds to commit suicide. A harmonic shriek, pitched just beyond the threshold of human agony, rolled across the frozen mineral basin. Then, the horizon simply collapsed. Voron Thala, commander of the Civil Defense Forces, was hurled off his feet before he even registered the flash. He hit the ferrocrete decking hard, the breath driven from his lungs in a ragged gasp. A monsoon of superheated glass shards and glowing, radioactive mineral dust washed over his position, burying him under a layer of burning debris. The thermal plating of his armor whined as it fought to disperse the sudden spike in temperature. The warning lights inside his visor flashing a frantic red. He dragged himself upright against the base of a shattered condenser array, his ears ringing with a profound, terrifying emptiness. The entire outer defense grid, a network of kinetic shields and automated railgun emplacements that had held the line for hundreds of hours, vanished in a span of 3 seconds. There was no static on the radio, no panicked screams over the tactical network, just the flat, dead tone of absolute erasure. The siege had dragged on for 10 relentless days. For 240 hours, the sky above the basin had been locked in a bruised, sickly amber hue, choked by the particulate fallout of constant orbital bombardment. The ground of Nacre 9 had vibrated without pause, a continuous tremor born from the unrelenting pounding of Serekh siege batteries, stationed just over the horizon. The defenders had grown so accustomed to the shaking that its sudden absence following a strike was more terrifying than the noise itself. Silence meant the enemy was recalibrating. Silence meant a new, heavier class of weapon was being brought to bear against their crumbling walls. Cinderglass was dying an ugly, grinding death. The city had lost nearly all of its wind towers, the towering structures that bled power from the moon's violent atmospheric currents. The water condenser farms, once sprawling fields of pristine moisture traps, were now twisted fields of burning scrap. The main food silos were smoking craters, their contents incinerated, and every single surface transit line had been severed by precision orbital strikes. What Voron was commanding was no longer a defense. It was a mathematically doomed delaying action. They were trading blood, failing equipment, and dwindling ammunition to buy fractions of time, paying for every single minute with dozens of lives. Through the choking haze of glowing dust, a figure crawled over the jagged remains of a collapsed command bunker. It was Deputy Commander Dea Orr. Her armor was scored with deep carbon burns, the ablative layers peeling away to reveal bare metal, and the left side of her faceplate was spiderwebbed with fine cracks. She did not bother to salute as she approached. Protocol and military formality had burned away a week ago, leaving only the raw, desperate instinct to survive another hour. She slid down beside Voron, her breathing ragged and heavy over the local comm channel, and plugged a hardline cable from her wrist gauntlet directly into his chest rig. The encrypted data dump flooded his helmet display with fresh, tactical horrors. "The orbital defense fleet is gone," Dea said, her voice dry and stripped of all emotional inflection. "The heavy cruisers broke formation an hour ago. The Serekh Vanguard swept them up like loose debris. I am watching the Allied identification tags blink out on the high orbital scans right now. They are going dark, one by one. It looks like a morgue board when the medics finally switch off the power." Voron stared at the tactical projection, scrolling across his visor. Crimson warning runes cascaded across his field of vision, painting a picture of total systemic collapse. The reality of their situation was a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders, threatening to crush him against the vibrating ground. Beneath the thick layers of thermal rock and reinforced plasteel, directly beneath their boots, 18,000 civilians were huddled in the deep geothermal bunkers. They were the miners, the technicians, the hydroponic farmers, the children. They were the entire lifeblood of the colony, trapped in the dark. The Serekh artillery had not been able to reach them yet. The crust of Nacre Nine was thick enough to absorb the kinetic shockwaves. But Varen knew the brutal doctrine of the Dominion. If the Serekh infantry breached the surface perimeter and secured the bunker access shafts, they would not negotiate. They would not take prisoners or demand surrender. They would simply seal the ventilation networks, pump the shafts full of corrosive gas, and turn those safe havens into massive, airtight tombs. He wiped a smear of glowing dust from his visor with a trembling hand and zoomed the tactical map out, focusing on the fresh enemy troop movements surging through the shattered eastern wall. Amid the chaos of the breach, something was fundamentally wrong. Varen narrowed his eyes, tracking the colossal, multi-legged Serekh armor columns as they poured into the basin. Standard siege protocol dictated that the enemy would fan out, secure the critical infrastructure, and encircle the remaining pockets of resistance to starve them out. But the Dominion forces were ignoring the primary generator hubs. They were ignoring the remaining anti-air batteries struggling to fire to the north. Instead, they were driving a massive, concentrated wedge straight through the ruins of the residential district, heading inexorably toward the old observatory sector at the desolate southern edge of the basin. Look at the heavy engineering units. Varen pointed a gauntleted finger at the display, tracing the movement of massive silhouettes on the screen. They are not bringing up siege mortars or plasma projectors. Those are deep crust penetrators. They are bringing in massive ground drills. Dea frowned, her eyes scanning the raw telemetry data flowing through the hardline. Why would they deploy heavy mining drills during a tactical infantry assault? There is absolutely nothing of strategic value in the old sector. It is just abandoned foundational strata, dry rock, and broken telescopes from the first settlement era. They are not trying to destroy the city anymore, Varen realized, a cold dread pooling in his stomach, chilling him despite the heat of the burning air. They are digging. They are looking for something buried deep underneath the observatory. The realization shifted the entire nature of the battle in his mind. This was no longer a simple conquest or a punitive strike against a rebellious colony. The Serekh had spent massive resources, sacrificed dozens of ships in orbit, and burned a thriving city to the ground just to reach a specific coordinate on the map. Whatever lay dormant beneath the ancient observatory, the Dominion wanted it with an absolute, terrifying desperation. Varen severed the hardline connection, yanking the cable free, and switched his comms to the general command frequency. The static hissed and popped, punctuated by the ragged breathing and panicked shouts of his surviving squad leaders. "Listen to me," Varen ordered, his voice echoing through the helmets of the scattered, battered defenders across the burning city. The enemy is concentrating their armor and engineering assets toward the southern observatory sector. They are completely ignoring our flanks. I want every remaining heavy weapon, every functional kinetic barrier, and every able-bodied fighter pulled back from the northern rim immediately. We are forming a final choke point at the central transit hub. A brief, agonizing hesitation hung on the channel before a wounded squad leader responded, his voice thick with pain. "Commander, if we abandon the north, they will have a clear path to the secondary bunker shafts. We cannot leave the civilians exposed. We have to protect the people." "They do not care about the civilians," Varen countered bitterly, the truth tasting like ash in his mouth. "They are after whatever is under the observatory. But the primary access shafts to the geothermal levels intersect right beneath our position at the hub. We have to hold the central plaza. We hold the shafts. We lock down the heavy bulkheads. We bleed them for every single meter of ground they try to take." He looked at Dea. She nodded slowly, understanding the grim, unforgiving mathematics of his tactical plan. There was absolutely no hope of victory left. The Allied fleet was reduced to drifting dust and frozen corpses. The orbital lanes were choked with enemy dreadnoughts, ready to rain fire down on any survivors. No one was coming to save them. The very best they could achieve now was to pile their own bodies high enough to stall the Serekh advance. "Take the eastern ridge," Varen told Dea, reaching to his belt and handing her his last reserve power cell for her heavy rifle. "Set up the magnetic mines in the bottleneck. Make them pay for the approach. We are just throwing ourselves into the furnace." "Varen," she said quietly, snapping the cell into her weapon with a loud click. "I know," Varen replied. He drew his sidearm, checking the charge indicator glowing faintly in the gloom. He knew perfectly well that they were not fighting to win. That foolish dream had died 10 days ago when the first ships fell from the sky. They were fighting to force the enemy to slow down. They were fighting so that the 18,000 terrified souls huddled in the dark, sweltering heat beneath their feet, might have death arrive just 1 hour later. He engaged his helmet seals, blocking out the smell of burning ozone and vaporized stone. "Hold the line," he whispered into the comms. The ground heaved violently, throwing jagged pieces of rock into the air, as a colossal Serekh drill machine breached the outer plaza, its massive tungsten teeth grinding through the ferrocrete with a deafening roar. Varenthele stepped out from the cover of the ruined condenser, raised his weapon into the blinding amber storm, and fired. The final telemetry ping from the Aegis Vanguard faded into static and then died completely. It was the last Allied heavy cruiser holding the high line above the moon. Its silence was not just the loss of a warship, it was a physical weight dropping onto the subterranean command bunker. Varen stood over the central holographic projection table. The tactical sphere floating in the center of the room, usually a comforting swarm of green and blue friendly transponder codes, was now a solid, terrifying void of crimson. The colony of Nacre 9 had officially lost orbital superiority. Any standard fleet response from the core worlds of the Alliance was at least 14 days away. They did not have 14 days. They barely had 14 minutes. In the dimly lit communications room, adjacent to the main deck, the Civilian Emergency Council argued furiously through a heavily degraded audio link. Their voices were frantic and pitched high with terror, grasping desperately at phantoms of salvation. The colony administrator was screaming for a white flag, demanding that the military broadcast a full and unconditional capitulation to the enemy fleet. Varen listened to the desperate pleas, while methodically stripping and cleaning the receiver of his primary rifle. He pressed the transmit key on the console. He did not yell. He simply told them the cold, unvarnished truth. He cited the unclassified casualty reports from the early border skirmishes. The Serekh Dominion did not occupy rebellious worlds. They cleansed them. They viewed armed defiance as a genetic flaw that needed to be aggressively sterilized from the galactic gene pool. Surrender was not a negotiation for terms of survival. It was merely an agreement to line up neatly for the slaughter. If the colony raised a white flag, the enemy would simply stop using explosive ordnance and start pumping localized nerve agents into the ventilation systems to preserve the underground infrastructure intact. Varen categorically rejected the order from the Civilian Council to stand down. He was not harboring any foolish optimism or heroic delusions. He simply understood the enemy doctrine. He preferred dying on his feet with an empty rifle in his hands rather than choking to death on toxic gas in a dark holding pen. The command center settled into a morbid, suffocating rhythm. The frenetic panic of the initial surface breach had completely burned itself out, replaced by the cold, mechanical process of counting down to absolute zero. Logistics officers with faces pale under the flicker of dying lumen strips methodically cataloged the pathetic remnants of their survival. It was a brutal, unforgiving equation of subtraction. Quartermasters walked the lines counting every single remaining energy cell. They weighed the boxes of depleted uranium slugs by hand. They mapped out every structural choke point, every collapsed ventilation shaft, and every narrow service corridor intersection that could be rigged with high explosives. They distributed the final combat stimulant rations not to sustain life or treat injuries, but solely to keep hands steady on triggers for a few more minutes. Soldiers checked and rechecked their pressure seals, murmuring quiet prayers to whatever gods they still believed in, or simply staring blankly into the middle distance. Every man and woman in the bunker knew they were dead. They just had to manage the paperwork and the grim logistics of their own funerals while still drawing breath. From a cramped sensory terminal in the far corner of the room, a young signal technician named Fell raised a trembling hand. He was a boy barely out of the technical academy, his oversized headset making him look even more fragile against the backdrop of war. He called his commander, over his voice cracking with a strange mixture of fear and confusion. Fell had managed to retune a deep-crust seismograph, an instrument originally designed to monitor subtle tectonic shifts for the deep-core mining operations. He was not picking up the chaotic jagged spikes of surface bombardments, or the grinding crunch of the massive enemy drills that had breached the plaza. Instead, the glowing green screen displayed a rhythmic low-frequency sine wave, pulsing from directly beneath the abandoned southern observatory sector. It was slow and deliberate, like a colossal mechanical heartbeat. It was a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated up through the soles of their boots, feeling fundamentally structural. It was the distinct signature of an ancient, massive mechanism slowly cycling up from a deep, centuries-long sleep. Varen shoved aside the active combat overlays and dove directly into the heavily encrypted foundational archives of the colony network. He bypassed the recent civic records, the trade manifests, and the modern architectural blueprints, digging down into the raw geological survey files from the very first settlement era, long before the modern Galactic Alliance even existed. He found a heavily redacted schematic buried under layers of forgotten administrative security locks. It was a blueprint for a colossal, subterranean superstructure. The file name was locked, but the engineering designation read as the Aurelatus engine. The fragmentary text surrounding the diagrams described a prototype, meteorological, and gravity manipulation core. It was a massive terraforming engine originally built to tame the violent atmospheric currents of the moon, but it had been abandoned due to catastrophic mathematical instability. The builders realized the machine could just as easily tear the moon apart as heal it. It had been intentionally shut down, sealed away, built over, and carefully erased from the public consciousness of the colony for generations. A heavily encrypted burst transmission from a forward scout shattered the tense silence of the archive reading. The scout, pinned under a collapsed transit rail deep in enemy territory, reported a massive sudden shift in the Serekh combat doctrine. The enemy vanguard was no longer just drilling blindly to cause terror. They were aggressively deploying heavy architectural reinforcement, gear plasma cutters, and dedicated combat engineering brigades directly over the exact surface coordinates of the buried core. They were setting up massive, overlapping energy shields to protect the dig site from the surviving defenders, rather than pushing forward to kill them. It was the final, horrifying proof. This was never a standard siege. The entire war, the slaughter of the orbital fleet, the systematic destruction of the surface city, it was all just a brutal, elaborate key designed to unlock the ancient machine buried deep in the bedrock. The Serekh wanted the engine. Varen closed the archive file, his jaw set tight. The crushing reality of the situation crystallized in his mind, focusing his thoughts into a sharp, lethal point. He turned back to the remaining command staff. The air in the bunker was stale, smelling of old sweat copper wiring and ozone. He ordered the main thermal blast doors to the lower civilian vaults completely locked down. He ordered the engineering teams to physically weld the massive hinges shut from the outside. There would be absolutely no retreat down the shafts. The civilians were locked in the dark safe from the crossfire, but entirely dependent on the soldiers above them, holding the line. He then ordered the remaining garrison to break from their cohesive defensive formations and scatter into the ruins. They were to form decentralized autonomous kill teams. Every shattered barricade, every blind corner, every flooded service hatch between the enemy vanguard and the observatory axis was to become a meat grinder. He issued his final operational directive to the remaining troops. They were no longer fighting to win the war. They were fighting to make the Serekh bleed for every single inch of ground above the machine. As the heavy blast doors clanged shut across the ruined city, sealing their fate on the surface, Varen racked the slide of his rifle, preparing for the final charge. The countdown to the end of their world had reached its final minutes, and they were going to make the enemy pay for every second. The northern storm front, a churning, bruised mass of toxic amber clouds that had swallowed the high atmosphere for over 240 hours, suddenly became the focal point of a new, terrifying phenomenon. Down in the shattered ruins of the city, the surviving defenders braced their broken bodies against the jagged ferrocrete, gritting their teeth in agonizing anticipation of the next resonant artillery barrage. Muscles corded tight, eyes squeezed shut beneath cracked visors. They waited for the invisible sonic wave that would turn their pathetic cover to dust. But the killing blow did not come from the Serekh batteries entrenched on the horizon. The absolute violence came directly from above. A blinding, searing flash of sheer kinetic friction ripped the heavy heavens wide open. The sky itself seemed to scream in protest. A physical, agonizing tearing sound that utterly drowned out the howling, radioactive wind. Through the glowing wound in the atmosphere, 3 massive silhouettes punched through the dense cloud layer. They were descending at an angle of attack that defied every established law of aerospace physics and basic self-preservation. No sane pilot, whether biological, cybernetic, or purely synthetic, would ever dare attempt such a suicidal, vertical vector. It was a plunge straight down the gravity well of the moon, surrendering entirely to the brutal grip of terminal velocity, turning the massive vessels into synthetic meteors aimed squarely at the surface. Varen tracked their blazing descent through his cracked optical sensors, his breath catching painfully in his ash-coated throat. His tactical display, previously a depressing graveyard of dead signals and enemy markers, suddenly flared to life with 3 intense, emerald-green identification tags. They were broadcasting standard, heavily encrypted Galactic Alliance handshakes. Yet, as the colossal shapes broke through the lower atmospheric deck, trailing massive, turbulent plumes of superheated plasma and vaporized atmospheric moisture, their physical forms violently contradicted the friendly electronic signals. These were not the sleek, aerodynamic dropships or the heavily shielded, elegant bulk transports utilized by the wealthy core worlds. Their hull configurations were entirely alien to his long military experience. They were brutalist, uncompromising, angular slabs of blackened ablative armor, utterly lacking the graceful curves, glowing propulsion rings, or delicate sensory arrays of conventional military craft. They looked far less like interstellar spaceships and much more like crude, sharpened iron anvils hurled downward by a deeply angry god. And they were absolutely not slowing down. There was no desperate deployment of forward retrothrusters, no shifting of aerodynamic glide flaps to catch the thick air, no attempt whatsoever to initiate any form of a controlled, survivable landing sequence. They were simply going to crash into the crust of the moon at catastrophic speeds. Then, the nightmare escalated, and the ships began to intentionally disintegrate. Or at least, so it appeared to the terrified observers on the ground. Along the blackened flanks of the 3 plunging vessels, massive explosive bolts detonated in perfectly synchronized, rippling lines. Entire outer sections of the heavy hulls blew outward, instantly swallowed and ripped away by the howling slipstream. From the gaping, fiery wounds running along the sides of the ships, dozens upon dozens of burning iron blocks were violently ejected into the screaming air. It looked exactly as though the immense vessels, realizing their own impending, inescapable doom, were vomiting out their own internal bulkheads and reactor casings in a frantic, futile attempt to shed dead weight before impact. Down in the mud, blood, and glowing ash, the exhausted defenders watched the spectacle in horrified, paralyzed fascination. The general consensus immediately rippling through the fragmented, static-laced tactical network was that they were witnessing the catastrophic structural failure of a doomed, last-minute reinforcement attempt. Perhaps they were nothing more than automated decoys, or perhaps a final, desperate volley of unguided kinetic suicide munitions dumped just before the ships shattered against the rocky basin. The heavy iron blocks, glowing a bright, furious cherry red from the unimaginable friction of their unshielded re-entry, plummeted toward the battlefield like a devastating shower of apocalyptic hellfire. But halfway to the broken ground, the chaotic, tumbling descent morphed into terrifying, calculated, and deeply predatory order. The falling debris suddenly bloomed with hundreds of simultaneous, blinding white microthruster bursts. The random, spinning trajectories snapped instantly into sharp, mathematically perfect descent vectors. These were not random chunks of a dying starship hull. They were individual, heavily armored drop pods, and they were actively, aggressively steering themselves toward the threat. The dense cluster of burning iron separated rapidly, spreading out widely across the amber sky like the spread fingers of a colossal, flaming hand reaching down to crush the earth. They swept over the sprawling battlefield in distinct, highly aggressive arcs, ignoring the empty ruins and targeting the most heavily fortified, impenetrable enemy positions with completely impossible precision. The first wave slammed directly into the heavily reinforced silicate dome of the former Central Botanical Gardens, which had been converted into a massive Serekh observation and command post. The kinetic impact did not merely break the thick dome, it instantly vaporized the entire upper hemisphere and drove a colossal, crushing shockwave of pulverized glass and shattered armor deep into the enemy ranks huddled below. The second wave hit the main shattered commercial avenue, turning the ruined thoroughfare into a perfectly straight string of localized, devastating craters that swallowed entire companies of alien infantry. More pods hammered relentlessly, directly into the heavily shielded heart of the Serekh artillery batteries, silencing the devastating resonance cannons in a deafening cacophony of twisting metal and bright blue secondary plasma explosions. Every single touchdown was an isolated apocalyptic event, a brutal hammer blow striking the cracked anvil of the world, sending geysers of molten rock and raging fire hundreds of feet into the toxic air. The ground heaved violently, throwing Varen hard against a rusted, groaning bulkhead. The sheer kinetic force of the simultaneous impacts was entirely staggering, momentarily stunning both the desperate defenders and the besieging alien army into absolute silence. The thick dust had not even begun to settle. The massive craters were still glowing white-hot, when the true, terrifying nature of the payload was finally revealed. The heavy, scorch-marked blast doors of the iron blocks did not hiss open with the hydraulic grace of standard infantry transports. They were violently blown outward by internal explosive charges, kicking up fresh, billowing clouds of ash and blinding smoke, and from the heart of that fire, massive armored figures simply stood up. There was absolutely no pause for disorientation from the brutal, bone-crushing drops that would have liquefied the internal organs of most known species. There were no ranking officers shouting over the din to rally broken formations, no tentative scanning of the deadly perimeter, no cautious textbook securing of a beachhead. The very instant their heavy boots hit the scorched earth, the warriors were already moving forward at a full, terrifyingly predatory sprint. They were heavily plated, their bulky armor scarred, pitted, and blackened by the heat of entry, their heavy weapons raised in firing streams of hypervelocity death before the surrounding Serekh infantry could even comprehend that anything inside the falling debris had survived the impact. They completely bypassed the standard, civilized doctrines of taking cover and laying down suppression fire, crashing headlong into the Dominion lines like a physical, unstoppable force of nature. They fought with a terrifying, absolute silence, their sheer physical momentum carrying them straight through shimmering energy shields and heavy armored barricades as if they were made of dry parchment. Varen's optical display flickered wildly, struggling to process the sudden, overwhelming influx of hyper-aggressive movement across the grid. Then, a massive emergency override signal punched aggressively through the heavy Serekh local communications jamming. It was broadcast on a wide, open, unencrypted channel, translating directly into the native dialect of the colony with brutal efficiency. The text scrolled across the bottom of his cracked visor in stark, uncompromising block letters. Human. Skyfall Regiment. Hold your fire guard the vaults. We take the Sky Scar. Varen stared at the glowing words, a deep, cold shiver racing down his spine, completely separate from the freezing chill of the atmospheric storm. Humans. He knew of them only from the wild, highly improbable, and often terrifying rumors traded by deep space merchants and cynical, battle-hardened mercenaries over cheap synthetic liquor. They were an infant, unrefined species on the vast galactic stage, possessing a highly volatile mixture of primitive, pack-based aggression and terrifying, rapid technological adaptability. The dark stories claimed they were the certified madmen of the Alliance military, the ones who eagerly accepted the nightmare contracts that high-end logistical combat computers calculated as absolute 0% survival probabilities. They were the specific species that the older, wiser, and more biologically refined races utilized only when a catastrophic situation required not a delicate diplomatic scalpel, but a massive, blunt sledgehammer swung with pure, suicidal intent. Watching them now, tearing mercilessly through the supposedly impenetrable enemy front lines with raw, unadulterated, and horrifically efficient violence, the rumors instantly ceased to be exaggerated barroom tales. They were terrifyingly, undeniably real. For the first time in his long, bloody military career, Varen truly understood why the broader galaxy spoke of the humans of Earth with such a complex, uneasy mixture of profound awe and deep, lingering dread. They did not wage war with the cold, calculated, algorithmic precision of the Serekh, nor did they fight with the desperate, defensive nobility of the native colonists. They fought as if the physical universe itself had deeply, personally offended them, and they were utterly determined to beat it into total submission with their bare hands. What Varen witnessed through the cracked optics of his helmet was not a military engagement according to any recognized galactic doctrine. Standard combat, especially against the methodical Dominion, was a brutal, grinding equation of attrition. You dug deep trenches. You established overlapping fields of fire. You calculated acceptable casualty margins. And you ground the opposing force down until their logistical threshold finally snapped. The human assault, unfolding rapidly across the shattered urban landscape, was something entirely different. It behaved less like a tactical infantry maneuver and far more like a catastrophic physical phenomenon. They did not attempt to engage the thick Serekh front line in a traditional exchange of firepower. They simply bypassed the very concept of resistance altogether. They acted as a hypervelocity projectile, a solid mass of kinetic fury punching straight through a brittle pane of glass, leaving the surrounding structure shattered but ignored. At the absolute tip of this living, breathing spear was a heavily armored figure, broadcasting the singular identification tag of Rook. To Varen, watching the jagged, fragmented tactical feed from his vantage point, Rook did not appear to be reacting to the chaotic, explosive environment. Instead, the human commander moved as though possessing a pre-calculated, precognitive map of the entire combat zone, complete with exact firing angles and the precise detonation times of every incoming shell. Rook would abruptly pivot a fraction of a second before a heavy plasma bolt scorched the exact airspace his chest plate had just occupied. He hurled high-yield fragmentation charges into completely empty, ruined courtyards exactly 2 seconds before a heavily armed squad of Dominion shock troops blindly charged into the calculated blast radius. It was a terrifying, flawless synchronization with the chaotic rhythm of the enemy artillery. Rook slipped through the deadly, narrow intervals of heavy suppression fire with the impossible, fluid grace of water, rushing over jagged rocks, never breaking stride, never pausing to assess a kill. Further complicating the already fractured Dominion response was a human scout operating under the callsign Kite. The alien besiegers relied heavily on rapid subterranean deployment, utilizing short-range, massive burrowing units to quietly flank entrenched defensive positions. Yet, every single time the alien vanguard attempted to breach the shattered surface behind the advancing human line, Kite was already standing there. The scout seemed to possess an unnatural, almost predatory sensitivity to the microscopic seismic tremors of the deep crust. Before the segmented, grinding mandibles of a Serekh subterranean transport could even crack the scorched ferrocrete pavement of the city streets, Kite would plant specialized, shaped seismic charges directly over the predicted emergence point. The resulting subterranean implosions sealed the enemy tunnels before they were ever fully formed, instantly burying the would-be ambushers alive under thousands of tons of crushed bedrock and fused soil. Kite was not fighting the visible enemy on the surface. The scout was systematically executing the subterranean reinforcements before they even realized they were officially part of the battle. Varen's initial, cynical assessment of the humans as nothing more than cold, hyper-efficient killing machines was violently upended by a combat medic identified on the grid as Mender. In the swirling, blinding chaos of the totally destroyed commercial district, a badly wounded squad of native colonial militia had been heavily pinned down by a Dominion rotary cannon, their personal ablative armor failing rapidly under the sustained, punishing barrage. Mender did not hold position and wait for Allied suppressing fire to clear a safe path. The medic vaulted cleanly over a crumbling, burning barricade, firing a massive, heavy auto rifle single-handedly to keep the alien gunner flinching, while utilizing the other arm to physically drag bleeding, immobilized native militiamen out of the designated kill zone. The heavy human armor took multiple glancing plasma hits, sparking violently and venting white coolant gas. But Mender simply ignored the tremendous kinetic shock that would have pulverized a lesser soldier. As Varen watched the medic haul a colonial trooper, twice his own mass, behind a heavily reinforced concrete pillar, a profound, humbling realization struck him. These humans had not plunged into this absolute hellscape merely to etch their names into some glorious, blood-soaked ledger of galactic military history. They were actively bleeding, taking massive risks to preserve lives they had absolutely no political or moral obligation to care about. Simultaneously, deep within the enemy rear echelon, the Dominion heavy artillery batteries, previously the most dominant and terrifying force on the battlefield, began to literally tear themselves apart. A human electronic warfare specialist designated simply as Ghost had somehow bypassed the quantum locks and infiltrated the heavily encrypted, closed-loop tactical grid of the Serekh forces. Varen watched in utter disbelief as his command display dissolved into complete digital lunacy. Enemy automated targeting reticles suddenly snapped onto their own heavily armored transport columns. Massive resonance cannons, fully primed to obliterate the advancing human front line, abruptly swiveled on their mounts and unleashed their devastating structural payloads directly into adjacent Serekh antimatter ammunition dumps. Ghost was not simply jamming their communications to cause confusion. The unseen human was actively, maliciously weaponizing the entire enemy infrastructure against itself, fundamentally rewriting the complex Dominion targeting algorithms in real time. The once strictly disciplined alien siege lines rapidly dissolved into a paranoid, fratricidal meat grinder, utterly unable to distinguish friend from foe through their deeply compromised sensory feeds. Yet, despite observing this overwhelming, multifaceted tactical dominance, Varen noticed the most deeply unsettling aspect of the entire human offensive. They were absolutely not attempting to secure the territory they so violently cleared. In traditional, recognized warfare, ground taken from the enemy was ground to be heavily fortified, garrisoned, and aggressively defended against the inevitable counterattack. The Skyfall Regiment treated the hard-won terrain of the city as nothing more than a temporary, disposable springboard. They left exposed flanks constantly. They completely abandoned highly defensible structural choke points, and they utterly ignored the scattered, disorganized remnants of alien squads bleeding out in the deep rubble. They possessed a singular, fanatical, almost psychotic objective. Every single footstep, every expenditure of rare ammunition, every drop of bright red spilled blood was meticulously, ruthlessly calculated to carve a perfectly straight, bloody corridor directly toward the desolate, crumbling ruins of the abandoned observatory sector. Looking at this relentless, dangerously linear momentum, a cold, heavy knot of pure dread formed in the pit of Varen's stomach. This was not a standard counterattack intended to break a lengthy siege. The human soldiers were completely ignoring the wider tactical reality of the entire basin, because they were clearly operating on an entirely different temporal scale. Varen suddenly, clearly understood that there was a hidden, invisible clock ticking down in the immediate background of this slaughter. There was a catastrophic, unknown milestone rapidly approaching, moving so incredibly fast that conventional military strategy, self-preservation, and standard unit cohesion were rendered entirely obsolete. The humans were not actually fighting the Serekh army. They were locked in a desperate, hyper-violent, full-sprint foot race against a completely unseen apocalypse. His initial, breathless awe at their sheer combat prowess slowly, inevitably curdled into a completely new, profound type of terror. The true, underlying nightmare of the human species, Varen realized as he watched them carve through the invincible alien horde, was not the sheer volume of extreme violence they could output, nor the terrifying, brutal array of weaponry they so casually wielded. It was the fundamental, horrifying speed at which they processed existence and consequence. They could assess a completely doomed, mathematically impossible scenario, rapidly calculate the necessary, horrific sacrifices required, and execute a completely suicidal, planetary-scale breach in the exact amount of time it took other, supposedly wiser species simply to schedule a preliminary command briefing. They lived, fought, and died in a jagged, hyper-accelerated tempo that no other rational biological creature in the known galaxy could ever possibly hope to endure. And right now, as the sky burned and the ground screamed, that terrifying, unbearable speed was the single, solitary thing standing between the 18,000 souls of Nacre Nine and total, absolute annihilation. The localized command frequency crackled, cutting through the heavy static of the jamming fields. It was not the panicked voice of a colonial squad leader or the grim tactical updates from Dea. The voice that filled Varenthal's helmet was startlingly steady, a deep, synthesized baritone smoothed by internal dampeners, devoid of the frantic adrenaline that saturated the burning surface. It was the human commander, Rook. He did not ask for covering fire. He did not request a situational report on the enemy flank, nor did he demand heavy ordnance support from the surviving militia. Instead, Rook asked for ghosts. He demanded the master cryptographic keys to the foundational infrastructure, the archaic access codes to the deep maintenance tiers that had been poured shut with ferrocrete nearly 3 centuries ago. Varen hesitated, crouching behind a twisted girder as a stray plasma bolt hissed through the smoke above his head. He demanded to know why a hyper-lethal strike team was concerning itself with forgotten basement levels, while the Dominion army was still tearing the city apart. Rook did not mince words. The human explained that their electronic warfare specialist had not just scrambled the enemy targeting grids. Ghost had actively strip-mined the Serekh flagship data vaults before the drop sequence even initiated. The Dominion had never cared about the mineral wealth of Cinderglass Basin. They did not care about establishing a strategic beachhead on Nacre Nine. The entire planetary siege, the slaughter of the orbital defense fleet, the methodical leveling of the commercial sectors, it was all an elaborate, incredibly violent distraction. The true objective was buried directly beneath the ruined planetary observatory. "They are going for the Aurelatus," Rook stated, the name echoing in Varen's ears with the weight of a death sentence. "Your ancestors did not build a terraforming engine, Commander. They built a gravity tether. The Serekh intend to reverse its polarity." The sheer scale of the revelation hit Varen harder than the physical shockwave of the earlier bombardment. If the Dominion successfully hijacked the ancient machine, they would not just control the atmospheric storms. They would turn the entire moon into a colossal, inescapable snare. The Aurelatus could project a localized gravity, well so intense it would physically drag the responding Allied rescue fleets out of the high-orbit vacuum, snapping their keels and pulling thousands of massive dreadnoughts down into a catastrophic, fiery pile of scrap metal. The city of Cinderglass was nothing more than a brittle ceramic shell, hiding a cosmic weapon. "The problem," Rook continued, his voice cold and analytical, "was that the Serekh deep crust drills had triggered automated seismic lockdown protocols. The main transit shafts were collapsed. The digital maps were completely useless down there. The human strike team had the firepower to reach the core, but they were essentially flying blind in a three-dimensional subterranean maze. They needed a native biological guide. They needed someone who knew the dead zones. Decades ago, as a raw junior officer assigned to infrastructure oversight, Varen had been forced to memorize the original settlement schematics. He knew where the old pneumatic transit tubes intersected with the dead coolant lines. He knew the location of the manual pressure valves that bypassed the digital grid. In a cruel twist of fate, the supreme commander of a dying army was suddenly reduced to the single, most irreplaceable asset of a subterranean infiltration mission. When Varen relayed his intention over the encrypted tactical channel, Dea Orr immediately and violently objected. Her voice was strained, punctuated by the sharp crack of her heavy rifle. She argued that the defensive line at the central hub was fracturing. The Serekh infantry were regrouping for a massive, coordinated push toward the civilian access shafts. If Varen abandoned the command post to go crawling through the dark with a squad of alien psychopaths, the fragile morale of the surviving militia would shatter completely. Varen listened to the desperate gunfire filtering through her microphone. He understood her logic, but he also saw the terrifying mathematics of the wider war. He told his deputy commander the bitter truth. Holding the surface plaza was a hollow victory if the Dominion secured the engine room. If the Serekh powered up the Aurelatus and inverted the local gravity field, the heavy blast doors protecting the 18,000 civilians would not matter. The sheer localized pressure would crush the underground shelters like tin cans, turning the geothermal vaults into a mass grave before a single enemy soldier ever set foot inside. The surface battle was no longer a fight for survival. It was merely a loud, bloody diversion. He officially transferred all command authorities, access codes, and remaining defensive assets to Dea. He ordered her to hold the line until the plaza literally collapsed beneath her boots. And then, he cut the connection before she could argue further. Varen moved swiftly through the burning ruins, slipping past Serekh patrols, until he reached the designated rendezvous point at the edge of the observatory crater. The human strike team was already there, a cluster of imposing, ash-covered silhouettes standing around the jagged lip of a massive, dark fissure that plunged deep into the bedrock. They did not offer salutes or formal greetings. Rook simply tossed Varen a heavy coil of synthetic repelling line, and the descent into the abyss began. The air grew instantly colder as they dropped past the shattered layers of modern infrastructure, leaving the deafening roar of the surface war behind. The darkness was absolute, pierced only by the sharp, narrow beams of the humans' shoulder-mounted utility lights. They navigated a treacherous vertical maze of rusted support beams and crumbling stone ledges. It was during this tense, silent descent, hanging suspended over a bottomless pit of forgotten history, that Rook casually confessed a detail that fundamentally altered Varen's perception of his saviors. Varin asked when the rest of the Alliance fleet was scheduled to arrive, assuming the Skyfall Regiment was simply the vanguard of a massive, coordinated counteroffensive. Rook paused his descent, his heavy boots gripping a narrow outcropping of shale. "They are not coming, Commander," Rook said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the dead acoustics of the shaft. "The Alliance High Command denied the deployment request?" Varin froze, staring up at the bulky shape of the human leader. He demanded to know how that was possible, how a military unit could be on the ground if the deployment was denied. Rook resumed his climb downward, his tone completely matter-of-fact. The bureaucratic logistical computers calculated that Nacre 9 was already a total loss. They deemed the atmospheric interference too hazardous and the enemy presence too overwhelming. They wanted to wait 2 weeks to assemble a multi-system armada and retake the ruins. But we knew that waiting 14 days meant we would only be arriving to catalog the bodies. So, we did not wait for the official authorization. We bypassed the fleet quantum locks, stole the orbital drop coordinates, and executed the jump on our own authority. The heavy silence that followed the statement was far more oppressive than the physical weight of the Earth surrounding them. Varin processed the sheer, unprecedented magnitude of that insubordination. In any civilized galactic military, what the humans had just committed was high treason. They had effectively gone rogue, stealing experimental warships and plunging into a mathematically unwinnable meat grinder without any legal sanction, logistical backing, or hope of extraction. The revelation sent a complicated, conflicting shiver down Varin's spine. The humans were not the perfect, disciplined weapon he had initially assumed. They were wild, unpredictable, and dangerously insubordinate. Yet, as he looked at the armored figures moving purposefully through the terrifying dark, that exact insubordination made them infinitely more trustworthy. They had not come to Cinderglass Basin because a cold, calculated algorithm ordered them to. They had not come with the absolute certainty of victory or the promise of glorious reinforcement. They had looked at a condemned world, saw the impossible odds, and decided to tear the sky open anyway, driven entirely by their own terrifying, uncompromising moral compass. It was a realization that made the humans seem simultaneously like the most dangerous creatures in the known universe, and the only ones truly worth fighting beside when the end of the world finally arrived. The descent into the forgotten belly of Nacre 9 was a journey backward through geological and technological time. The further the small strike team dropped beneath the burning surface, the more the architecture shifted from the utilitarian ferrocrete of the modern colony to something vastly older and deeply unsettling. The subterranean transit system was a claustrophobic, decaying maze of crushed pressure tunnels and heavily corroded industrial suspension bridges, spanning bottomless, echoing chasms. Thick, freezing, cooling mists clung to the graded walkways, reducing visibility to a mere handful of paces. Giant, calcified conduits, resembling the petrified roots of some colossal, mechanical tree, twisted and drove themselves deep into the bedrock. These were the dead arteries of the first settlement, fossilized in the dark for generations, their original purposes lost to the slow, grinding decay of the moon. Varin felt an oppressive weight pressing against his chest, a profound sense of trespassing into a forbidden tomb that should have remained permanently sealed. Moving through this primordial dark, the human squad operated with a terrifying, unspoken synergy. Varin watched them function not as a collection of individual soldiers, but as a single, highly specialized organism of war, seamlessly assembling itself in the gloom. Rook took the vanguard, his heavy armored frame navigating the treacherous, crumbling ledges with predatory grace, his weapon always tracking the unseen depths. Kite, the scout, moved like a shadow detached from its host, constantly sweeping the perimeter with handheld seismic augers, checking every blind corner before the main body advanced. Mender guarded the rear, an imposing bulkhead of medical armor and heavy suppression firepower, ensuring nothing could collapse their fragile escape route. Ghost drifted between them, a silent phantom trailing cables and splicing into exposed, rusted data ports, constantly reading the ambient electromagnetic pulse of the dead ruins. Now, a new specialist named Locke stepped forward to clear the physical obstructions. When a massive, fused blast door blocked their path, Locke did not use loud, clumsy explosives. He applied specialized, localized kinetic rams that shattered the molecular bonds of the ancient hinges, dropping the massive metal slabs in near-total silence. To Varen, it was a masterclass in lethal efficiency. The terrifying realization of their true disadvantage struck when Kite halted the formation near a massive, subterranean aqueduct. The scout pointed a gauntleted finger at the cavern wall. Intersecting the ancient, rough-hewn stone corridor was a perfectly smooth, circular tunnel, its edges fused into black, reflective glass. It was not a ruin. It was a fresh Serekh phase drill shaft. Ghost immediately interfaced with a residual energy signature lingering on the glassy surface. The data confirmed the worst fears of the native commander. The alien siege army had not just recently breached the crust. They had been silently, surgically tunneling down here for the past 10 days, masking their deep crust drilling operations beneath the relentless, deafening artillery barrages on the surface. The entire massacre of Cinderglass City, the leveling of the residential sectors, and the slaughter of the defensive lines had been nothing more than a loud, bloody, theatrical performance designed strictly to hide this precise, subterranean theft. The enemy was already inside the vault. They pushed harder, abandoning stealth for brutal speed, following the glassy alien tunnels until the narrow corridors abruptly gave way to an impossible, cavernous expanse. Varen stepped out onto a narrow observation gantry, and his breath caught in his throat. The core chamber of the Aurelatus engine was not merely a room. It was an industrial cathedral, built on a scale that defied human or Serekh comprehension. Suspended in the center of an impossibly deep, cylindrical abyss were 3 colossal, concentric metal rings, each one large enough to encompass a heavy dreadnought. They hung in a delicate, terrifying stasis, anchored by massive, tensioned cables that vanished into the darkness above and below. But it was the heart of the machine that commanded absolute awe. Woven between the immense rings were thick, pulsating veins of pure, frozen lightning. It was a terrifying, beautiful lattice of raw, captive energy, glowing with a deep, furious violet hue that illuminated the abyssal chamber. The energy did not flow like electricity. It pulsed with a slow, heavy rhythm, looking exactly like the exposed, luminous blood vessels of the dying moon itself. Varen felt a primal, instinctual terror looking at it, a deep cosmic dread of a power that mortals were never meant to touch. Ghost immediately moved to an ancient, massive control console jutting from the edge of the gantry, its crystalline interface completely dormant. The electronic warfare specialist deployed a swarm of microscopic, silver data mites that burrowed directly into the archaic hardware. For several tense minutes, the only sound was the deep, resonant thrum of the captive lightning. Then, Ghost spoke, the synthesized voice echoing flatly in the massive space. The specialist had successfully decrypted the foundational operational protocols of the Aurelatus. The machine was not a simple weapon with a single activation switch. It was a highly complex, deeply unstable triad system. Ghost explained that to wake the engine from its centuries of sleep without triggering a catastrophic, planetary-scale implosion, it required manual, simultaneous synchronization at 3 widely separated geographical nodes. The first node was the primary control interface located right here, at the absolute bottom of the core chamber abyss. The second node was the atmospheric tether array, situated at the very peak of the ruined surface observatory, miles above their heads. But the third node was the most terrifying variable. The machine demanded a massive, external gravitational counterbalance to finalize the stabilization cycle. It required a physical, high-mass anchor located precisely in low planetary orbit. Before Varen could even begin to process the logistical impossibility of coordinating such an activation, Ghost delivered a second, far more horrifying piece of intelligence. The Serekh Vanguard had already reached the lower levels. The alien strike force commander, an Archon designated as Sir, had not just breached the security grid. He had physically hardwired his own alien nervous system directly into the localized diagnostic network of the Aura Lattice. The consequences of this violent, biodigital intrusion were immediate and lethal. Deep within the abyssal walls of the chamber, thousands of small, metallic alcoves began to grind open. They were the original, automated maintenance drones of the first settlement, dormant and harmless for hundreds of years. But under the corrupted, invasive control of Archon Sur, their primary directives were completely rewritten. Down in the dark, thousands of optical sensors flared to life, shifting from a passive, pale yellow to a violent, aggressive crimson. The silent, floating caretakers of the machine had just been repurposed into a massive, automated hunter-killer swarm, and they were rising from the depths specifically to eradicate the human strike team. Locke racked the charging handle of a heavy rotary cannon, staring down into the rising sea of red lights. Mender and Kite flanked the narrow gantry, establishing intersecting fields of fire. The living war machine was preparing to hold the line against an ancient, mechanical tide. But the impending firefight was secondary to the apocalyptic cliffhanger Ghost translated from the corrupted data streams. Archon Sur was rapidly bypassing the safety protocols. He was violently forcing the three nodes to align through brute, digital force. Ghost turned from the console, looking directly at Varen and Rook. The specialist stated the raw, terrifying mathematics of their failure. If the alien commander managed to complete the synchronization cycle before the humans could manually override the three nodes, the Aura Lattice would fully awaken in its weaponized state. The machine would instantly generate an inverted singularity. The entire amber sky of Nacre Nine would instantly transform into a completely inescapable, crushing gravity well. Every single Allied rescue ship, every remaining orbital defense platform, and every piece of floating debris within 100,000 miles would be violently yanked from the vacuum of space and dragged down to the surface as an apocalyptic rain of burning metal. The moon would not just be conquered, it would be turned into a cosmic graveyard, crushing the last hope of the galaxy under the weight of a falling sky. The massive, echoing cavern of the core chamber demanded an immediate and brutal fracture of their fragile alliance. There was absolutely no time for debate or prolonged tactical assessment as the crimson optics of the corrupted maintenance swarm began to rise from the abyssal depths like a swarm of angry, mechanical locusts. The human strike team divided itself with a terrifying, unspoken pragmatism, transforming from a single spear into three distinct, highly specialized daggers. Locke and Ghost did not hesitate. They vaulted directly over the rusted railing of the observation gantry, deploying thin, high-tensile ascension cables to plunge straight downward into the blinding violet glare of the primary node, diving willingly into the very teeth of the automated metallic tide. Rook and Kite spun on their heels, their heavy boots kicking up sparks as they rocketed back up the sheer vertical incline of the primary maintenance shafts, racing to intercept the heavy Dominion forces currently converging on the upper atmospheric tether. That left Varen standing beside the hulking, heavily armored form of the combat medic, Mender. Their critical objective was not to fight the alien vanguard, but to wage a desperate war against the rapidly failing thermal infrastructure of the moon itself. As Varen and Mender sprinted laterally through the claustrophobic, winding access tunnels toward the primary civilian holding sectors, the native commander checked the environmental telemetry, scrolling frantically across his cracked wrist display. The numbers were climbing at a terrifying, exponential rate, painted in bright, flashing warning colors. The Aura Lattice engine was not simply waking up. Its erratic, forced power fluctuations were violently bleeding massive amounts of raw, uncontained thermal energy directly into the surrounding bedrock. Varen felt a cold, suffocating horror grip his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the ambient temperature. The deep geothermal vaults, where 18,000 terrified colonists, currently huddled in absolute darkness, were never engineered to withstand the proximity of an active, runaway terraforming core. They were strictly designed for short-term atmospheric pressure relief. At the current, aggressive rate of thermal escalation, the heavy plasteel blast doors would offer zero protection. The sealed vaults would simply bake the colonists alive, transforming rapidly from secure havens into massive, reinforced ovens in a matter of minutes, completely eradicating the population without a single Dominion soldier ever firing a shot. The localized tactical channel hissed violently with electromagnetic static before the ragged, exhausted voice of Deputy Commander Dea cut through the heavy interference. She was miraculously still, holding the line on the burning surface. But her rapid report was laced with a new, profound layer of panic. The Serekh infantry had completely halted their relentless wave assaults on the central plaza. Instead, heavy engineering columns were towing a massive, heavily shielded siege engine toward the very edge of the observatory crater. Dea identified the terrifying silhouette from classified, archaic intelligence files. It was a gravity lance. It was a weapon of absolute, focused structural annihilation, designed to fire a concentrated, sustained beam of inverted mass. The Dominion did not simply want to shatter the observatory dome to gain physical entry. They intended to fire the lance directly into the upper node of the aura lattice, violently forcing the ancient, highly sensitive machine to learn the geometric equation of total collapse. There was absolutely no time to explain the impending, invisible apocalypse to the terrified masses buried below. Varen and Mender reached the primary subterranean distribution hub just as the ambient air temperature began to actively blister their exposed skin beneath their armor. They had to orchestrate a massive, completely blind migration through the dark. Working with frantic, brutal precision, they bypassed the completely fried digital subroutines and began manually engaging the rusted, heavy release valves of the old industrial cooling mist systems. Mender utilized his massive, hydraulically assisted armored bulk to physically pry open the fused, rusted track switches of the ancient, abandoned subterranean cargo rail network. They began the agonizing process of packing hundreds of weeping, highly confused civilians into open-topped, heavily oxidized ore trams. They shunted the massive, groaning metal carts through the pitch-black tunnels, moving them from the rapidly superheating lower vaults into a series of scattered, secondary pressure pockets located slightly closer to the surface. It was a terrifying, delicate balancing act of shuffling fragile lives across a crumbling, burning chessboard. Varen screamed himself hoarse over the deafening hiss of the venting steam pipes, desperately trying to keep 18,000 terrified souls moving just one single step ahead of the rising, invisible thermal tide, praying constantly that the creeping panic would not ignite into a lethal, blind stampede in the suffocating dark. Amidst the deafening roar of the grinding rails and the panicked cries of the displaced civilians, Varen kept his internal comms locked onto the human tactical frequency. What he heard flowing continuously between the scattered members of the Skyfall Regiment fundamentally altered his entire understanding of their bizarre species. Ghost was currently being actively hunted by a relentless swarm of corrupted, razor-wired drones deep in the suffocating abyss. Kite was bleeding heavily from a jagged shrapnel wound, while tightly pinned down in a vertical, echoing access pipe. Yet, their rapid radio chatter was completely devoid of panic, hysteria, or even elevated stress. Instead, they exchanged dry, morbidly dark jokes about the abysmal quality of alien architectural standards and wagered entirely hypothetical currencies on which squad member would completely exhaust their ammunition reserves first. It was a jarring, entirely surreal soundtrack to the literal end of the world. Varen, slowly, profoundly realized that this constant banter was not a display of psychopathic apathy or a lack of comprehension regarding their impending doom. It was a highly evolved, deeply necessary psychological shield. The humans felt the exact same crushing, paralyzing terror that he did. But they had aggressively, culturally trained themselves to compartmentalize it. They wore their dark, cynical humor like a thick, secondary layer of ablative armor, ensuring the crippling fear could never travel down their arms to paralyze their trigger fingers. Suddenly, Rook's voice violently cut through the morbid, static-laced banter, slicing away the dark humor with absolute, freezing authority. The human commander, fighting his way tooth and nail toward the ruined observatory peak, realized with cold clarity that they were completely running out of time. The Serekh gravity lance was nearly locked into its final firing position on the surface, and he and Kite simply lacked the sheer mass of heavy firepower required to break the entrenched defensive perimeter surrounding the critical upper node. Rook immediately opened a direct, highly unencrypted channel to the heavily damaged human transport ship, still holding a tenuous, entirely suicidal orbit above the amber storms. He did not ask for covering fire. He did not ask for a tactical extraction. He demanded a second skyfall. And he demanded that the payload be dropped not onto the sprawling battlefield, but directly into the violently swirling electrical storm pillar currently wrapping around the ruined observatory. The immediate response from the orbital flight controller was laced with absolute, undisguised incredulity. The controller warned forcefully that executing a drop pod launch onto a standard battlefield was one thing, but dropping directly into the eye of the localized atmospheric tether was physical suicide. The aura lattice was already generating a violent, churning pillar of raw magnetic turbulence that reached all the way to the upper stratosphere. The controller stated with brutal clarity that the immense electromagnetic shear would violently rip away every single ablative heat shield, immediately shred the stabilizing glide flaps, and completely crush the standard landing modules long before they ever touched the cloud deck. It was a literal meat grinder, made of pure lightning and wildly fluctuating gravity. Rook did not rescind the completely insane order. To save the thousands of innocent lives currently buried in the dark, they had to be willing to execute a maneuver that no sane, logical military doctrine in the galaxy would ever authorize. The heavy silence that followed his demand on the orbital channel was far heavier than the miles of bedrock currently surrounding Varen. When the response finally came, it made the blood in Varen's veins run completely cold despite the blistering heat of the tunnels. Out of the entire remaining, battered crew on the orbiting human ship, there were only 12 human volunteers who possessed the specific high-altitude maneuverability gear and the sheer, unadulterated lunacy required to attempt a totally unshielded, manual freefall through a localized magnetic hurricane. Rook immediately confirmed the drop coordinates. The human commander ended the transmission by declaring that he would hold the exact center of the shattered observatory dome to manually guide their descent, deliberately placing himself directly in the crosshairs of the Serekh gravity lance to serve as their living, breathing beacon. The fate of the entire moon now rested entirely on the shoulders of 12 falling humans, racing a beam of inverted gravity to the very top of a dying sky. Cinderglass Basin was completely consumed by a catastrophic, two-tiered crisis, a simultaneous fracturing of both the heavens above and the deep earth below. On the ruined surface, the Serekh Dominion activated the terrible engine of their gravity lance. It did not roar with the concussive boom of traditional artillery. Instead, it emitted a deep, marrow, vibrating hum that sucked the ambient sound out of the burning air. A colossal sphere of compressed, inverted mass began to coalesce at the tip of the siege weapon, bending the surrounding light into a sickening, distorted halo. Directly beneath the ravaged city, the aura lattice engine continued its violent, erratic awakening. The ancient machine was actively tearing at the fundamental fabric of physics. Within the subterranean tunnels, the localized gravity began to warp and fail. Heavy droplets of condensation from the ruptured cooling pipes no longer fell to the grated floors. They drifted aimlessly upward, suspended in midair like tiny, shimmering jewels. Chunks of shattered ferrocrete floated gently off the ground, rotating lazily in the sudden weightlessness before violently slamming back down as the gravitational waves wildly fluctuated. Trapped in the suffocating mid-levels between these two apocalyptic forces, Deputy Commander Dea Orr anchored the fragile thread of colonial survival. She and her battered, bleeding remnants of the civilian defense force held the massive, vaulted caverns of the primary subterranean transit hubs. They stood shoulder to shoulder before the cavernous mouths of the access shafts, their weapons raised not against the Serekh, but against the creeping edge of total hysteria. Dea barked orders until her throat bled, orchestrating the massive, terrified influx of refugees. She forced the chaotic tide into manageable, sequential waves, ensuring the desperate colonists did not trample each other in the suffocating darkness. Simultaneously, from the sweltering heat of the rerouted maintenance network, Varen Thale successfully punched a massive, overriding transmission through the jammed colonial emergency grid. He broadcasted a brand new, highly complex series of evacuation routes directly to every single surviving shelter coordinator. He guided the panicked masses away from the rapidly superheating primary thermal veins, steering all 18,000 souls through forgotten cargo bypasses and dormant hydroponic access tunnels. His rapid, desperate calculations pulled the population back from the brink of being boiled alive, just as the ambient temperature in the original holding sectors crossed the lethal threshold. Far below the evacuation chaos, in the blinding violet glare of the abyssal core chamber, the human heavy specialist named Locke made a completely devastating discovery. After violently repelling a massive, chitinous wave of corrupted maintenance drones, Locke forced open the heavy, archaic casing of the primary manual regulatory station. It was not a simple switch or a digital interface. It was an energy cradle, an open, heavily shielded sarcophagus lined with thick, pulsing neural conductive mesh. Locke stared at the brutal, ancient engineering and realized the terrible truth. The original architects had failed to build an automated buffer capable of handling the sheer, planetary-scale voltage required to synchronize the massive engine. The regulatory station would only function. It would only hold the unstable nodes together if a living, biological body laid completely flat within the cradle, acting as a living fuse to manually absorb and stabilize the catastrophic energy spikes until the very last second of the cycle. There was no hesitation in the human. Locke did not radio for permission or express any profound regret. The specialist simply began unsealing the heavy outer layers of combat armor, preparing to step into a bed of raw, uncontained planetary voltage. Beside the cradle, ghost fingers flew across the crystalline console, finally shattering the absolute last layer of Archon Sur, completely alien cryptographic protocols. The electronic warfare specialist uncovered the ultimate, horrifying gambit of the Serekh commander. Ser did not want to simply destroy the planetary observatory to deny the humans the high ground. He was intentionally aiming the massive gravity lance directly at the shattered dome, so the highly adaptive, terraforming intelligence of the Aurelatus could actively observe and absorb the physical impact. Ser was using the siege weapon to teach the ancient machine the exact geometric equation of spatial collapse. If the energy from the Serekh weapon connected with the upper node, the Aurelatus would instantly memorize the destructive pattern, permanently locking the entire moon into an eternal, inescapable gravity well. The race to the upper node became a completely suicidal sprint. Near the jagged, shattered base of the observatory, the human scout kite moved like a blurred shadow through the ruined foundations. A hidden Serekh phase drill suddenly breached the floor directly in front of the human commander Rook, vomiting a heavily armed squad of alien shock troops. Kite did not hesitate. The scout launched forward, taking the full, devastating brunt of 3 heavy plasma bursts directly into the chest plate. The kinetic force lifted the Scout entirely off the ground, but Kite twisted mid-air, burying a heavy, shaped seismic charge directly into the throat of the newly opened phase tunnel. The resulting implosion instantly vaporized the alien vanguard and permanently sealed the breach. Kite hit the broken floor hard, armor completely shattered, bleeding profoundly from a dozen catastrophic wounds. The Scout did not try to stand, but simply dragged a heavy suppression rifle over a pile of rubble, laying down a completely unbroken wall of covering fire. Kite was bleeding out, but the Scout had successfully torn a bloody, open path through the impenetrable enemy line, allowing Rook to sprint past the barricade and charge directly up the crumbling stairs toward the observatory peak. Above the shattered dome, the amber sky violently tore open for the second time. The human orbital controller had not lied. No ship could possibly survive the magnetic hurricane swirling around the tether. So, the humans abandoned the ships entirely. 12 individual warriors dropped from the high atmosphere, diving straight into the churning, violent heart of the localized electrical storm. They did not use armored drop pods. They were in specialized, high-altitude freefall harnesses, plunging through the violent atmospheric shear with their arms pinned to their sides. It was a scene of absolute, terrifying, epic beauty. Each falling warrior trailed a massive, thick coil of hyperconductive tether line, glowing with a brilliant, blinding cerulean blue. As they plummeted through the dark, amber clouds, the 12 warriors looked exactly like a barrage of localized lightning bolts that had been violently grabbed by the hand of God and hurled directly down at the surface of the moon. The violent magnetic shear tore at their bodies, ripping the heavy ablative plating right off their suits. But they held their incredibly tight, aerodynamic formations, steering entirely with subtle shifts of their shoulders and legs against the screaming wind. They were attempting the impossible, using their own falling bodies to drag the necessary grounding wires directly through the eye of a localized hurricane to connect the orbital node to the terrestrial machine. But the brutal mathematics of warfare cared absolutely nothing for epic heroism. Just as the 12 blue streaks of falling light pierced the lowest layer of the cloud deck, rapidly approaching the jagged, open roof of the observatory, the Serekh Dominion fired their ultimate weapon. The gravity lance did not produce a beam of light. It fired a solid, localized cylinder of absolute, crushing darkness. The weapon discharged with a sound like the entire moon, taking a sharp, agonizing intake of breath. The beam of inverted mass struck the center of the reinforced observatory dome, a full 60 seconds before Rook or the falling Skyfall team could possibly reach the upper node. The impact was not an explosion. It was a complete structural unraveling. The massive, heavily reinforced silicate dome of the observatory did not just shatter. It folded inward upon itself, groaning in absolute agony as the fundamental laws of mass and volume were violently rewritten. And as the observatory broke, the catastrophic chain reaction finally reached the sky. The thick, toxic amber clouds stopped churning and froze completely solid for one terrifying fraction of a second. Then, a massive, jagged black fissure physically tore across the firmament. The atmosphere itself began to fracture like a pane of cheap glass under a heavy hammer. The terrifying geometry of the Serekh weapon successfully bleeding directly into the waking mind of the buried machine below. The impact of the Serekh gravity weapon did not simply dissipate into the atmosphere. Instead, it lingered, carving a massive black wound directly into the center of the shattered observatory dome. The tear in reality was an absolute void, a localized absence of light and matter that actively pulled the surrounding environment into its agonizing depth. High above the ruined city of Cinderglass, the toxic amber sky physically reacted to the unnatural anomaly. The heavy cloud deck stopped its violent churning and began to visibly curve inward, bowing toward the black wound, as if the entire moon was taking a sharp, desperate intake of breath. The fundamental laws of physics were rapidly fracturing under the crushing weight of the inverted mass, creating a terrifying visual distortion that made the horizon itself look like a crumpled piece of paper. Through this terrifying inward collapsing sky, a massive shadow suddenly blotted out the dying light. High in the fractured exosphere, one of the colossal human warships abruptly broke its holding formation. It did not fire maneuvering thrusters to correct its pitch, nor did it deploy any defensive countermeasures against the ambient magnetic shear. It simply killed its own orbital engines and surrendered entirely to the violent, terrifying pull of the newborn gravity well. From his vantage point, deep in the trembling transit shafts, Varen watched the tactical feed monitor the descent with cold horror. At first, the Colonial Network registered the plunge as a catastrophic navigational failure, assuming the ship had lost power. But as the immense, blackened slab of a starship accelerated directly toward the center of the atmospheric anomaly, correcting its freefall with microscopic bursts of emergency propulsion, the horrifying truth of the human strategy clicked into place in his mind. The ancient machine required 3 points of synchronization, and the final node was a massive external gravitational counterbalance located in low orbit. The humans did not possess a specialized deployment rig or an artificial moonlet to stabilize the cycle. They were deliberately using their own warship as a disposable mass anchor. Varen felt an icy chill that had nothing to do with the fluctuating temperatures of the deep crust. The Skyfall Regiment was willingly feeding a fully crewed heavy cruiser into a cosmic meat grinder, utilizing a priceless vessel, and everyone remaining aboard as a simple consumable component, just to keep the Aurelatus engine from swallowing the planet whole. It was a level of absolute strategic sacrifice that defied all civilized military logic. Back in the primary subterranean transit hub, the physical toll of the crumbling moon was completely visceral. A massive, jagged chunk of the cavern ceiling had violently sheared off during the initial gravity lance strike, raining heavy debris down upon the civilian loading queues. Deputy Commander Dea Orr had taken a glancing blow to her helmet. The reinforced visor was completely shattered, driving sharp, microscopic fragments of silicate directly into her left eye. She was bleeding profusely the side of her face, a gruesome mask of crimson, but she absolutely refused to surrender her post. Half-blind and swaying from severe concussive shock, Dea physically shoved the paralyzed, terrified colonists into the rusted ore trams. She screamed orders over the deafening groan of the shifting tectonic plates, demanding that the transport drivers push the ancient engines well past their maximum thermal tolerances. She anchored herself to the loading platform, vowing to remain in the crushing dark until the very last transport carriage successfully cleared the danger zone. Miles below her, in the blinding violet glare of the abyssal core chamber, the human heavy specialist named Locke stood before the archaic energy cradle. The open sarcophagus pulsed with an impossibly lethal voltage, a raw planetary current that crackled with enough kinetic fury to instantly vaporize standard infantry armor. Locke knew exactly what stepping into the neural conductive mesh would do to a biological nervous system. There would be no heroic survival, no miraculous medical recovery. It was a completely binary equation of absolute self-immolation. Locke reached up and violently unsealed the heavy locking mechanisms of the combat suit, letting the thick, ablative plating crash to the grated floor. Standing unprotected before the raging heart of the machine, Locke looked over at Ghost, whose hands were flying frantically across the ancient, crystalline interface. Locke did not offer a profound final sentiment or a desperate plea for rescue. The human simply ordered the electronic warfare specialist to just finish the math. Then, without a single second of hesitation, Locke stepped directly into the cradle of lightning, and the entire chamber screamed as the biological circuit was completed. Simultaneously, on the highest peaks of the ruined surface, the desperate race against the clock completely dissolved into pure chaotic instinct. Rook and the few surviving members of the second orbital drop violently slammed onto the fractured buckling ring of the observatory. Their descent through the magnetic hurricane had been an unmitigated nightmare, stripping away their heavy gear and scrambling their localized communication arrays. The flawless, terrifying coordination that had defined the initial human assault was entirely gone. Their headsets offered nothing but shrieking static and the disjointed, broken fragments of desperate shouts. There was no overarching tactical command left to coordinate the final push. Rook and the surviving paratroopers simply drew their remaining weapons and charged headlong into the swirling spatial distortion, fighting purely on muscle memory and an unyielding refusal to die quietly. Deep within the bowels of the machine, Varen reached the outer edge of the central control platform, just as the Serekh forces breached the primary firewall. But it was not a wave of alien infantry that confronted him. The sea of crimson optics belonging to the corrupted maintenance drones suddenly shifted, glowing with a sickly, pale green. The metallic swarms converged, merging their individual chassis into a towering, shifting avatar of the Dominion commander. Arkan did not speak through an audio receiver. His synthesized voice bypassed the physical air and projected directly into Varen communication feed. The alien intelligence offered a perfectly logical, completely sociopathic compromise. Ser recognized that the forced synchronization was tearing the machine apart and threatening to annihilate the entire prize. The Archon proposed a ceasefire. He offered Varen the master codes to restabilize the localized gravity fields directly beneath the surface city, ensuring the upper ruins and whoever remained in them would survive the cosmic transition. In exchange, Varen only had to walk away from the primary console, abandon the lower geothermal vaults to the crushing pressure of the inverted singularity, and willingly hand the absolute control of the Aura Lattice engine over to the Dominion. It was a false choice, wrapped in the cold pragmatism of survival, asking him to sacrifice 18,000 buried civilians to save a shattered, empty plaza. Varen stared up at the towering, shifting face of the machine avatar. He thought of Dea bleeding in the dark to save people she did not even know. He thought of the human called Kite, holding a fatal choke point with a shattered chest. He thought of Locke burning alive in the cradle, and the colossal warship deliberately tearing itself apart in the upper atmosphere, just to provide a mathematical anchor for a world that was not theirs. The sheer weight of their terrifying selfless momentum completely eradicated any lingering doubt in his mind. Varen did not dignify the alien commander with a verbal response. He violently severed his connection to the local communications grid, plunging his headset into total silence. Between his position on the gantry and the ancient manual interface console lay a massive yawning chasm created by the collapsing central shaft. The distance was mathematically impossible for a standard biological leap, especially in heavy armor. But the localized gravity was buckling, fluctuating wildly, as the machine tore at the fabric of space. Varen holstered his weapon, took 3 rapid sprinting steps to the absolute edge of the crumbling platform, and threw his entire mass into the void. It was a point of no return leap, a complete surrender to the violently breaking laws of physics. As he hung suspended over the bottomless violet abyss, he looked up through the massive vertical shaft toward the surface. High above him, framed by the black wound in the sky, the blue streaks of human soldiers were still relentlessly falling through the torn firmament, racing the end of the world to the very bottom of the dark. The leap across the crumbling subterranean chasm felt like an eternity, but Varen Thala landed heavily against the ancient manual interface console. The 3 desperate threads of the impossible counteroffensive finally snapped together, forming a single, fragile circuit, spanning the entire depth of the moon. High above the toxic clouds, Rook boots slammed onto the shattered, buckling rim of the upper observatory ring. Miles below, in the blinding violet glare of the core chamber, the human heavy specialist named Locke screamed silently within the blistering neural cradle, acting as a living biological fuse. And suspended high in the outer exosphere, the colossal human warship groaned as its thick hull plates began to peel away deliberately, sacrificing its own structural integrity to serve as the critical third node. Through the deafening roar of the dying planet, Ghost, synthesized voice, suddenly sliced through the heavy static of Varen helmet comms. The electronic warfare specialist had uncovered the absolute final layer of the machine ancient security protocol. The Aurelatus was not merely a terraforming engine. It was a profound philosophical test, designed by its long-dead creators. Ghost revealed that the machine would only accept the command to preserve life if two completely distinct biological intellects, originating from two entirely different civilizations, activated the primary and secondary nodes at the exact same microsecond. If the system detected only one species attempting the override, or if the timing was misaligned by even a fraction of a heartbeat, the engine would automatically assume a hostile localized takeover. It would default to its apocalyptic weaponized state and crush the moon into a singularity. The sheer impossibility of the task washed over Varen. The localized communications network was completely shredded. The channel connecting the native colonial commander at the bottom of the world to the human commander at the top of the sky was a chaotic mess of squealing electromagnetic feedback and heavily distorted machine translation syllables. They possessed no shared combat history, no rehearsed tactical protocols, and absolutely no cultural common ground to lean on. They had to achieve perfect mathematical synchronization through raw, blind intuition alone. Varen pressed his gauntleted hands against the glowing crystalline interface. Over the raging static, he listened intently to the deep, rhythmic thrum of the engine core and the ragged, heavy breathing of Rook transmitting from the surface. He closed his eyes, shutting out the blinding violet light, and began to count down out loud, his voice steady against the apocalyptic noise. 3, 2, 1. It was a leap of absolute faith across the vast, terrifying divide between two alien species. They both pushed the execution sequences in the exact same fraction of a second, relying entirely on an unspoken bond forged in the crucible of a dying world. Down in the energy cradle, Locke took the full, catastrophic brunt of the planetary surge. The human specialist held the volatile circuit open for those final 3 agonizing seconds, completely surrendering to the immense voltage as the armored suit literally began to melt into slag. Simultaneously, high up in the fractured sky, the human heavy cruiser finally reached its absolute structural limit. The massive warship snapped perfectly in half, its agonizing death throes providing the precise, violent gravitational counterweight required to balance the colossal cosmic equation. Everyone braced for the blinding flash of total annihilation, but the catastrophic explosion never came. Instead, the Aurelatus engine began to sing. A massive wave of pure crystalline energy erupted from the subterranean core, traveling vertically up the main transit shaft and bursting out of the shattered observatory dome like a geyser of solid light. It did not destroy the surrounding matter. It wove it together. A colossal shimmering grid of atmospheric lightning bloomed rapidly over the entire Cinderglass Basin. The brilliant energy net caught the crushing, invisible shockwave of the Serekh gravity lance in mid-air, arresting its destructive momentum completely. With a deafening celestial crack, the grid violently hurled that accumulated kinetic fury straight back up into the void of space. The tactical turnabout was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The invincible Serekh Armada, hovering arrogantly in low orbit, was immediately paralyzed. The revived atmospheric grid acted as a planetary snare, physically pinning the massive alien dreadnoughts against the vacuum. It violently stripped their advanced weapon systems offline and completely severed their quantum command networks. Down on the scarred surface, the supposedly unbreakable Dominion siege army was instantly transformed into a leaderless, panicked mob. Stripped of their orbital fire support and their mechanical superiority, the alien infantry broke formation and scattered into the wasteland, abandoning their heavy armor in the burning mud. Deep beneath the surface, the deadly environmental crisis rapidly subsided. Inside the claustrophobic geothermal vaults, the lethal temperature spikes plummeted back to normal habitable levels. The desperate evacuation lines held strong, and the 18,000 terrified civilians finally stopped suffocating in the dark. The city of Cinderglass was fundamentally broken, its infrastructure pulverized into ash, but the people were saved. And then, the most miraculous event of the entire 10-day siege occurred. Through the jagged open wound of the shattered observatory roof, the very location where the entire colony had gathered to await their inevitable execution, the heavy, toxic amber clouds finally parted. The first pure golden rays of a true, uncorrupted dawn broke through the clearing sky, washing over the ruined basin for the first time in over 240 hours. As the morning light illuminated the devastation, Varen witnessed the final, profound difference between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. The Skyfall Regiment did not celebrate. They did not plant victorious flags atop the rubble or pose triumphantly over the shattered remains of their conquered enemies. The very instant the immediate tactical threat was neutralized, the surviving humans seamlessly transitioned from terrifying apex predators to desperate first responders. Exhausted ash-covered soldiers dropped their heavy suppression rifles onto the cracked pavement and immediately began digging through the collapsed ferrocrete with their bare, bleeding hands. They fashioned crude stretchers out of armor plating to carry the wounded. They hauled the elderly and the terrified children up the broken elevator shafts on their own backs. They welded fractured transit rails to clear paths for the medics, reinforced the buckling doors of the civilian shelters, and gently pulled weeping native strangers to their feet. Watching them work, Varen realized that to the human soldiers, this brutal, exhausting labor of rebuilding was not a chore to be handled after the war was won. This physical act of saving lives was the actual victory. Varen Thale stood quietly in the cool morning air, watching Rook help a trembling colonial miner out of a ruined transport shaft. The native commander made a silent, solemn promise to himself. When the bureaucratic inquisitors of the Galactic Council inevitably arrived in their pristine diplomatic ships and demanded to know exactly what had transpired in the mud and blood of Cinderglass Basin, he would only tell them one fundamental truth. He would look the High Counselors in the eye and explain that the humans of Earth were not terrifying because they harbored a deep, inherent love for warfare and destruction. They were the most terrifying force in the universe simply because they were the only species completely willing to freefall through absolute hell twice in a single day, just to ensure that people they had never even met did not have to die alone in the dark. Thank you all for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can interact and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, hit the like button, and support the video by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.